Hi everyone, welcome back to Double A's Medicine. In this video, we're going to be learning about the radius. The radius is the lateral bone of the forearm, and we're going to be talking about its side determination, bony landmarks, and muscle attachments. So stay tuned till the end of the video, and let's get started. So firstly, we'll determine the side of the radius. So in order to determine the side of the radius, first of all, we need to know that what is the proximal end and what does the distal end look like. So the proximal end of the radius is disc shaped, and it is in the superior part it is concave, as you can see. The distal end of the radius is expanded, and distal end possesses a styloid process called the radial styloid, which always projects laterally. The distal end also has an articular surface which bears mainly two areas, a lateral triangular area and a medial quadrangular area. The shaft of the radius possesses three borders: the medial border or the interosseous border, which is the sharpest border. The sharpest border should be located medially, and this is the anterior border, which is oblique in its upper part and straight in its lower part. The posterior aspect of the radius can be distinguished from the anterior aspect because the posterior aspect possesses the dorsal tubercle of Lister on the distal end, while the anterior aspect surface on the anterior aspect is smooth. So considering all of these side determination points, we come to know that if we place the radius on the left forearm, we see that the medial border is medial border of the or the sharp border of the radius is facing medially. The anterior aspect of the distal end is smooth, and the radial styloid is projecting laterally, while the posterior aspect of the radius on the distal end possesses the dorsal tubercle of Lister. So we come to know that this is the radius of the left side. However, if we place the radius on the right forearm, we see that the medial sharp border is no longer projecting medially. It is actually located laterally, while the radial styloid is located medially, which should not be the case. It should be located laterally. So we come to the conclusion that this is the radius of the left side. So if we talk about the radius is the lateral bone of the forearm, and it is homologous to the tibia of the lower limb. Now the tibia is the medial bone of the leg. So you may be wondering why a lateral bone of the forearm is homologous to the medial bone of the leg. That is because of the different rotations of the lower limb bones and the upper limb bones during the embryological development of the limbs that occurs during the 6 to 8 weeks. So that is a very important concept. So if we talk about the radius, we notice that the radius is a typical long bone, as you can see right here. So a typical long bone, they all consist of a proximal end, a shaft that is called the diaphysis, and we have a distal end. The proximal end of the radius is called the head of the radius. This right here is the head of the radius. The head of the radius is disc shaped. The disc shaped head of the radius is concave in its superior part right here. This is concave in its superior part. This concave surface, superior surface of the head of the radius articulates with the capitulum of the humerus to form the elbow joint, to form part of the elbow joint. And we have the disc shaped head of the radius right here, which is covered by hyaline cartilage throughout. This articulates with the radial notch on the ulna to form the proximal radioulnar joint. The neck of the radius is a constricted portion located distal to the head of the radius. The head of the radius rotates freely in the joint capsule of the proximal radioulnar joint. That's all for the proximal end of the radius. Moving on to the shaft, we see that the shaft presents a tubercle proximally. This is called the radial tuberosity or the radial tubercle. The shaft has three borders. It has three borders and it has three surfaces. So the shaft, if we talk about its borders, so we have an anterior border. This is known as the anterior border of the shaft right here. This is called the anterior border. The anterior border runs from the anterior smooth part of the radial tuberosity above, and it is oblique in its upper half and it is straight in its lower half. The upper half is oblique and it's called the anterior oblique line, while the lower half is vertical. In the lower part, the anterior border terminates on the styloid process. This is the medial border. The medial border of the radius is sharpest. It's also called as the interosseous border, and also gives attachment to the interosseous membrane, which we will discuss later on. The medial border starts at the posterior rough surface of the radial tuberosity, and it moves all the way down, extends all the way down to the ulnar notch located on the medial side of the distal end of the radius. We also have a posterior border. Now the posterior border is like a reflection of the anterior border. It's just a reflection of the anterior border, but the posterior border is most prominent in its middle thirds. It's not as prominent in the proximal or the distal aspects. We also have three surfaces of the shaft. We have the anterior surface, which is located between the anterior border and the interosseous border. We have the lateral surface, which is located between the anterior and the posterior borders. We also have a posterior surface between the posterior and the interosseous border. The distal end of the radius is expanded and it is triangular. The distal end of the radius has four surfaces. We can see this is the anterior surface. This is the lateral surface. The lateral surface also contains the styloid process, which always projects laterally. And we have a medial surface. We also have a posterior aspect of the distal end. The posterior aspect of the distal end presents multiple tubercles. The most prominent tubercle right here is called the dorsal tubercle of Lister. So that's all for the major bony features of the radius. We also have an articular surface located at the distal most end. This is called the articular surface of the radius, and the articular surface presents two areas. There is this quadrangular area right here. You can see this quadrangular area which is located medially, and we have this triangular area. The triangular area articulates with the scaphoid bone of the carpus, while the medial quadrangular area articulates with the lunate bone, and together the distal articular surface and the scaphoid and lunate bone help to form the radiocarpal joint, or the wrist joint in short. So that was all for the major bony landmarks of the radius. Let's move on to the muscle attachments. So if we talk about the attachments on the radius, we'll move in a systematic order. We'll start from the proximal end, then we'll move on to the shaft, and finally we'll be talking about the attachments on the distal end. So before starting, please note that the red color on the bone represents the origin of the muscles. The green color represents the attachment of ligaments and joint capsules, while the blue color represents the insertion of muscles. So first of all, starting from the proximal end of the radius, right here, we see that the proximal end of the radius bears a neck. The medial aspect of the neck of the radius will give attachment to the quadrate ligament. The radial tuberosity consists of an anterior smooth part and a posterior rough part. The posterior rough part of the radial tuberosity, as you can see here, will give insertion to the tendon of the biceps brachii. That's actually how the biceps brachii helps supinate the forearm. Just distal to the insertion of the biceps brachii, we have the attachment of the oblique cord. So the anterior smooth surface of the radial tuberosity gives origin to the flexor digitorum superficialis. This origin also expands down to the upper part of the anterior oblique line. On the lateral surface, we have three insertions, as you can see here, 1, 2, 3. The insertion on the upper part of the lateral surface is the insertion for the supinator muscle. On the middle part of the lateral surface, we have the insertion of pronator teres, while on the lower part of the lateral surface, we have the insertion of brachioradialis. On the posterior surface, we see that we have two origins. The upper origin in the upper part of the posterior surface is the origin of the abductor pollicis longus, and the origin of the muscle on the lower part of the posterior surface is the origin of the extensor pollicis brevis. Actually, the abductor pollicis longus and the extensor pollicis brevis origins, they both expand on the interosseous membrane. Right here, like this, they both expand on the interosseous membrane. They are partially on the posterior surface, but partially they are also on the interosseous membrane. As you can see, we have the medial sharp border called the interosseous border of the radius, and as you can see, we have the attachment of the interosseous membrane on the lower half of the interosseous border. So now talking about the muscle attachments on the anterior surface, we see that the upper part of the anterior surface gives origin to the flexor pollicis longus muscle. The lower part of the anterior surface will give insertion to the pronator quadratus muscle. The insertion of the pronator quadratus also spans from the anterior surface, and it moves on to the medial aspect of the distal end of the radius, which is forming the ulnar notch for articulation with the head of the ulna to form the distal radioulnar joint. We also see that on the distal end we have the attachment of the joint capsule on the margins of the articular surfaces. The joint capsule of the wrist joint, it attaches on the margins, anterior margin and the posterior margin of the articular surface of the radius. So that was all it for the attachments on the radius. So if we talk about the posterior surface of the distal end of the radius, it is very important because it possesses several grooves for the channeling of the long digital extensors into the wrist. So we have mainly 6 grooves located on the posterior aspect of the distal end of the radius. The first groove, if we move in a lateral to medial sequence, so the first groove is located between the sharp crest-like border right here. This is the sharp crest-like border right here, and it is located between the styloid process. The sharp crest-like border and the styloid process forms the first groove. The first groove channels the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus and the abductor pollicis brevis. The second groove right here, it is located between the styloid process and the dorsal tubercle of Lister, and the second groove helps channel the tendons of the extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis. So both of the tendons, they pass through the groove like this. Just medial to the dorsal tubercle of Lister, in this groove right here, as you can see, this groove helps channel the extensor pollicis longus tendon. The fourth groove on the medial aspect of the radius on the posterior surface, it helps to channel right here. It helps to channel the tendons of the extensor digitorum, the extensor indicis. It also channels some neurovasculature, which includes the posterior interosseous nerve and the anterior interosseous artery. The fifth groove lies between the junction right here. The fifth groove lies between the junction of the radius and the distal end of the ulna, and the fifth groove helps channel the tendon of the extensor digiti minimi. Lastly, we have the sixth groove, which is located between the head of the ulna and the styloid, the ulnar styloid. That groove helps to channel the tendon of the extensor carpi ulnaris muscle. So that was all it for the 6 grooves which are located at the posterior aspect of the wrist joint, and they help channel the long digital extensors. And that pretty much sums up the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video as much as possible with your friends. In the end, stay blessed and happy, and see you in the next video.